Good morning. I'm Andrew Holcomb, and I will be reading Exodus 20:20 from the New International Version. Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid. God has come to test you so that the fear of God will be with you to keep you from sinning."
Thank you, Andrew. You look good in that jacket, man. Hey, church, good to see you all again. We're in a series in Exodus, as you know, if you've been with us. I want to just quickly catch you up because we have been on an amazing journey through the first 20 or so chapters of Exodus, in which God, through the leadership of Moses, leads his people out of slavery in Egypt towards the Promised Land, towards Canaan, giving the Israelites an identity as God's chosen people and a home in the Promised Land. But very quickly, just to kind of refresh our memories, let me catch you up on what's been happening and what we've already been through with these people. We'll go back to the Red Sea. You remember Exodus 14 and 15. The Israelites have just left Egypt. They've just started their journey, and along this journey there's a tower, a pillar of cloud and fire that's guiding them everywhere they go. That's the presence of God leading them, and that cloud leads them to the edge of the Red Sea and then stops. And then they soon realize that the Egyptians have changed their mind, and all of the Egyptian cavalry is pursuing them, and so they're trapped at the Red Sea. But that cloud comes around and it casts the supernatural darkness upon the Egyptian army. But in the light of the fire in the sky, the Israelites see before them the Red Sea start to part because of this wind that God sends. And there's this dry channel through the Red Sea with the water stacked in walls on both sides. And so the Israelites walk through this channel during the night. And in the morning, when the cloud lifts and the Egyptians see what's happened, they rush in to try to catch up to the Israelites. And then Moses stretches out his staff, and those walls of water collapse on top of the Egyptian army, wiping out the entire army. And the Israelites know they will never have to worry about Pharaoh's army again because they see the dead bodies all over the shores of that sea. And there's a celebration, obviously. And Moses leads the people in this sort of song or celebration in which they say, "This is my God." What's just happened, the God who's just done this, that's my God. And so that they make this declaration. And then over the next several weeks, that's what I would call a courtship. Because over the next several weeks, they go through a series of tests or experiences in which God's revealing himself, his nature to them, his personality to them. And what he does is show different ways where he's providing for them and protecting them. And so he provides water from a rock, and he provides manna, miraculously, bread from heaven every morning that appears like dew on the ground. And he drives quail into the camp so they have meat. He protects them from an attack of nomadic Amalekites. And so through all this, God is proving, through this courtship, God's proving, I want to protect you. I want to provide for you. Just like a man would want to prove that to a woman that he loves. And so I call that journey, as they go from Israel down the Sinai Peninsula, I would call that, or compare that to, a courtship. And then they finally get to the end of that journey, and they get to Mount Sinai. And that Mount Sinai, I would call that, at the end of that courtship, a proposal. Where basically God says, here's what I want. I want to have a covenant relationship with you. I want to be your God. I want you to be my people. And he gives them the choice. He says, will you enter into that agreement, that relationship with me? He says, I want to make you a kingdom of priests. I want to make you a holy nation, an example to all the rest of the world of how I, as God, want to commune with humanity. And all the people, when they are given this proposal through Moses, all the people responded in Exodus 19:8, we will do. Yes, they say, we will do everything the Lord has commanded. And so 3 days later, what happens next is what I would liken to a marriage or a series of wedding vows, what we would call the 10 Commandments. And the first of those 2 commandments is, remember, that the first one is, you shall have no other gods before me, or instead of me, or beside me. And the second is, you shall make no idols. You shall make no graven images when you are worshiping. You don't use any sort of physical manifestation of me, no idols. In Exodus 5:22, it reminds us, it says, these are the commandments the Lord proclaimed in a loud voice to your whole assembly there on the mountain from out of the fire, the cloud, and the deep darkness. Remember we said the 10 Commandments, the first time that everyone hears these, everyone literally hears them. Moses doesn't come down from a mountain with these two tablets and say, here's what God says. They all, tens of thousands of Israelites, all at the same time hear God's audible voice. So no, they're dealing with a living God who speaks to them. This is not something that Moses is just making up on that mountain. They know they are dealing with a living God who speaks to them, who can see them. And what he tells them, the first two things he tells them is, no other gods besides me and no idols. And they all say, Exodus, they all say, yes, we're going to do this. And so then Moses goes up on the mountain. And then from the next several chapters of Exodus 21 through 24, Moses is hearing from God, sort of, here's what this is going to look like. Here's how this marriage is going to look like. And what God is providing for them, which we're going to talk about more next week, is here's my plans for how we're going to live together. Here's my plans for how we are going to be, how you are going to be, so to speak, the family of God. And so Moses comes down from the mountain with these commands, which are the beginning of what we call the Mosaic Law, which is, it outlines in quite a bit of detail. It expands upon the Ten Commandments and outlines, here's the relationship between us and God. And he comes down from the mountain, and the first time he tells them, here's what God told me. And they all say, yes, we will do that. We will obey. Then he goes and he writes them down. And then he goes back and he reads them aloud to them. Exodus 24:7. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it aloud to the people. Again, they all responded, we will do everything the Lord has commanded. We will obey. And once again, they had heard up on that mountain. The first thing God said up on the mountain was, no other gods. No idols. No idols of gold. No idols of silver. And they come down and they hear that twice from Moses. And both times they say, yes, we will obey. And then one of the most extraordinary things, I think, in all of human history happens. God invites the leaders of Israel to come a little bit closer to the mountain and have a meal in his presence. They're basically going to have a meal with God. And what scholars say is this follows the format of what in that day and time was called the suzerain covenant. The suzerain was the greater or the more powerful partner in a treaty or a covenant or an agreement. And in a suzerain covenant or treaty, two parties, two families, two nations, two armies, they would come together and they would hash out, here is what we are agreeing to. Here's the terms of our treaty, of what our relationship, our trading relationship, whatever it is going to be from this point on. And so they lay that out. And then at the end of that whole process, they have a meal together, which shows that they're doing this in good faith. If you're sitting down with someone and sharing a meal, it shows that you do not intend ill will for them, that you are friends, that you are partners. And so following that similar process, God now, then this process, invites them to have a meal in his presence. And this is what it says. Exodus 24, 9 through 11, basically says they saw God. Here's what it says. Then Moses went up with Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and they saw the God of Israel. And under his feet there appeared to be a pavement of sapphire as clear as the sky itself. Yet he did not stretch out his hand against the nobles of the sons of Israel. And they saw God. And they ate and drank. Now elsewhere in Scripture it makes clear humans are not allowed to see, literally, physically, face-to-face see God. That's just not allowed. But in this instance, these guys saw some glimpse of God's presence. And we don't know what exactly they saw. It refers to God's feet, as if perhaps they just saw just his feet, just the hem of his robe. And again, how God physically manifests himself to these guys, we don't know. But what we can certainly know from this is there was no question that they understood God was a living being. This is a God who sees them, who audibly speaks to them, who they can see. This is a living God. And so after that meal, Exodus 24, verse 12, then the Lord said to Moses, come up to me on the mountain and wait there, that I may give you the tablets of stone with the law and the commandment which I have written for their instruction. Now, the last part of a suzerain treaty was that both parties would have a copy of the agreement, of the terms of the covenant, and then they would part and go their separate ways. That's how this is ending. Now God is calling him after the meal. God's calling Moses to say, okay, now let's make the copies of this agreement. And so the 2 stone tablets that Moses is going to carry down from that mountain, most times you see it depicted, it's 2 stone tablets, and there's the first 5 commandments on this side, and then the second 5 commandments on this side. More than likely, that's not what it was. More than likely, based upon the process in a suzerain treaty, this was inscribed on the front and the back, and one copy is the Israelites, the other copy is God's. And the plan is they're both copies are going to be kept in the tabernacle, in the Ark of the Covenant. And so following this suzerain treaty format, the next step is to write down the terms of the agreement. So Exodus 24, verse 13. So Moses rose with his assistant Joshua, and Moses went up into the mountain of God, and he said to the elders, wait here for us until we return to you. So if you read a little bit more in there, it looks like Moses went on up by himself to the top of the mountain. Joshua stayed somewhere on the mountain, but not directly with Moses. And then the rest of the leaders went back down to the camp. And the last time they see Moses is Exodus 24:18. Then Moses entered the cloud as he went up on the mountain, and he stayed on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. So remember, this whole time, throughout this whole time, that tower of cloud and fire that's been leading them has settled on Mount Sinai. And so it's described when he's given the 10 Commandments, it looks like a furnace churning out this smoke in this cloud. It's a fearsome sight. And Moses walks into that cloud and disappears from their sight. So Joshua is waiting where they had that meal. Everyone else goes down to the camp. All of that, just 4.5 months. From the time they left the Red Sea until the time that we are now in Exodus, just 4.5 months. What an incredible 4.5 months. What an incredible journey. Can you imagine experiencing God, seeing everything that they saw? Can you imagine all of that in just 4.5 months? And so now Moses is up there and God is laying out, here's how we're going to live together from this point on. Here's how you're going to be a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. And he's describing how blessed they are going to be in the promised land if they will just obey. Now remember, everything they've heard God say, remember everything they promised God that they will do, what do you think is going to happen next? I mean, after this incredible, literal, spiritual mountaintop experience, what do you think is going to happen next? Wait, what? A golden idol? That can't be right. Let's see what happens here. Exodus 32:1. When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses, what's his name? Who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what's happened to him. And Aaron answered them, take off the gold earrings that your wives, your sons, and your daughters are wearing, and bring them to me. So all the people took off their earrings and brought them to Aaron. He took what they handed him and made it into an idol, cast into the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. Then he said, these are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. And when Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of the calf and announced, tomorrow there'll be a festival to the Lord. So the next day the people arose early and sacrificed burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings. And afterward they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. That word revelry, if you look at how it's used elsewhere in the Old Testament, it likely has sexual connotations. What is most likely happening here is the worst sort of debauchery. Like what the pagan religions of that time did when they were worshiping their fertility gods. And then even worse, Moses comes down off the mountain and he sees what's happening. And he goes to his brother Aaron. The same brother Aaron who was having a meal with God just a month before this. And he asked him, Exodus 32, verse 21, what did these people do to you that you led them into such great sin? Do not be angry, my lord, Aaron answered. You know how prone these people are to evil. They said to me, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what's happened to him. So I told them, whoever has any gold jewelry, take it off. Then they gave me the gold, and I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf. Remember, this is a man in his 80s. This is not a 3-year-old. Here's my point. How do you think God feels at this point? Think back to everything he has done, everything he has said, everything he has shown them. Think back to how many times they have said, yes, we want to be your holy people. We want to do what you're asking us to do. We promise we'll be faithful. And then while Moses is up on the mountain getting instructions from God about how he wants to dwell with them, how he wants to bless them, they're down there fornicating in front of an idol. We had the courtship and the proposal and the marriage. And now we have this. If you're married, imagine if your spouse had committed adultery on your honeymoon. That's what happened here. That's the sort of punch to the gut that this is. Or if you're a parent, has your child ever blatantly lied to you multiple times? When you clearly told them not to be around certain people, not to go to certain places, and you're telling them that for their own good. And they are agreeing with you to your face, and then immediately they go and do exactly what you told them not to do, and they defy you. You know what that feels like? Well, that's what God felt like. That's what God the Father felt like in Exodus 32. And Aaron tries to pretend it just happened, as if he had no control over it. It reminds me, it's the same way that some people have an affair, and they say, it just happened. They discovered they had this incredible chemistry with someone at work or with an old friend on Facebook, and they fell in love. No couple falls in love or falls into bed because of some force beyond their control. If that happens, it happens because those people have made a series of decisions in which they have a choice. And our rationalization for so many of the sins that we commit, God wants me to be happy, so I think he's going to understand that I need this to be happy. Or I know what the Bible says, but I have to experiment with this to decide for myself if I think it feels wrong to me. I know what God said, but I need to see what it feels like to me. Or if everyone's doing this, how can it be so bad? How can it be such a big deal? I really think that to God's ears, all of those justifications, all of those excuses sound about like what's on that flip chart. Just about as ridiculous. Just about as insulting. When I read this, I get to this point of the story. And it's so tempting. Because what I tell myself is, how can they do this? I mean, I would never do that. I would never do something so blatant, so defiant as these Hebrews. I mean, if I had experienced everything that God had, or that these people had with God, that what they'd experienced, it was so real, it was so visceral. I mean, if I had seen those miracles, if I had heard God's voice, I would never have done that. I mean, if God would just show himself to me like he showed himself to these people, it would be so much easier for me to not fall into temptation. I could be such a better person. I could be such a stronger Christian if God would just show himself to me in the real ways that he did for them. Right? I mean, we tell ourselves, we would never do that. And if we had what those folks had in their relationship with God, we would never do so many of the sins that we do. And okay, you know what I've decided? When I think about, so why do we have this story? Beyond the obvious reason that it had happened, but what are we supposed to take away from that story? And I think it's an answer to that assumption that I make that I would never do that. Now, yeah, they heard the voice of God. But we can hear God too. Anytime we want. On your lap, in your hands, on your phones, there's a Bible. 2,000 and some pages of a love letter from God to you. You can hear God anytime you want to hear God. That Bible contains 1,500 years of history, full of miracles, full of literal times that God has been involved in people's lives. Yeah, we may not have seen all the miracles that they had seen, but we can read about 1,500 years worth of the same things happening. And yes, they could look up. When they were doing this, they could look up on the mountain and they could see this cloud. They could see this supernatural fire burning up there and know that that's God up there. That is the presence of God. It was that obvious to them. The morning that they're bowing to a calf, that morning for breakfast, they ate manna. When there's no explanation for manna, it just appears. It's supernatural. It's a miracle. So we think, well, yeah, but I mean, they could just look up and they could see that fire up on the mountain, and they could see God's here. Well, we can't look up to a fire on a mountain. But every morning, we can look up, and we can see a sun. And we see that sun go across the sky, and because of our modern scientific knowledge, we know that that sun is just the right distance from us to allow us to live. What astronomers say is if we were further out in the galaxy, but not so much, our orbit would be too elliptical, and it would draw us both too near and too far from the sun, and which would either evaporate all of our water or lock all of our water permanently into ice. And our Earth, as it's going around that sun, our Earth rotates at a tilt of 23.5 degrees. And our moon is exceptionally large. And that moon is just large enough to have a gravitational pull that it keeps us at that tilt. Because if we didn't have that, we have seasons now, but if we didn't have that keeping us at that angle, we would have drastically deadly temperature changes. The air, the sky through which we look at that sun, has an oxygen content of 21%. If it was just a little more, if it was 25%, we'd be in constant danger of spontaneous combustion. If it was just a little less, down to 15%, most of all living beings would suffocate. I can give you 1,000 examples. We don't have a fire on a mountain. But we have evidence of God everywhere around us if we just think about it. If we just open our eyes. If you've never seen it, I strongly encourage you to watch the video. It's going to be, I think, a screenshot up there in just a second. It's called True You, Does God Exist? It's one of the best resources I've ever seen on this topic, where a scientist is explaining how science reveals God. Scott Lee has taught a couple classes on that curriculum. He's got that there's a special shelf in our church library where we have that curriculum along with several other resources that Scott Lee has put together that talk about the intersection of science and faith. And what you're going to learn, whether you get that resource or whether you go to something else, the more you dig into this, what you learn is that science is not making it more difficult to believe in God. On the contrary, with every discovery, the invisible God is becoming more obvious. And even 2,000 years ago, before we had all this modern scientific knowledge, the Apostle Paul, even back then, 2,000 years ago, the Apostle Paul firmly believed that everyone should be able to clearly see evidence of God's existence. Because that's what he said in Romans 1:20. He says, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse." See, we're not presented a world in which there is an equal amount of evidence for God and against God. Faith is not a 50-50 proposition in which it's just as plausible to believe in God as to not believe in God. I don't think it works that way at all. According to Paul, God is clearly everywhere around us all the time. I want you to be aware of that. I want you to think about that this week. I want you to be aware that when you're in your car, and when you are in your house, and when you're out with friends, and when you're completely by yourself, God is there too. What you say, what you watch, God sees. God knows. I want you to be aware of that so that you will fear God. Now, don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm not saying I want you to be afraid of God. I don't want you to be afraid of God, but I want you to have the fear of God. See, there's a difference. Remember our opening that Andrew read, Exodus 20:20. Moses said to the people, do not be afraid. God's come to test you so that the fear of God will be with you to keep you from sinning. Moses said, don't be afraid. God is not an unpredictable, abusive, mean father. I don't want you to be afraid of God. But Moses says, don't be afraid, but I do want you to fear God. Meaning you have a healthy respect for him that will keep you from sinning. But if that's going to work, I can tell you fear God. But if that's going to work, if that's going to really make any difference in your life, you have to know God. Because if you don't know God, it's not going to make much sense. It's obvious the Israelites don't know God yet. Because after just 40 days, they act like Moses is disposable and God's commands are just suggestions. It shows how fragile and weak their commitment to God is, which makes what happens next that much more remarkable. Exodus 34:1. So after all this mess, after all this depravity, after this horrible adultery, here's what happens next. Exodus 34:1. The Lord said to Moses, chisel out 2 stone tablets like the first ones, and I will write on them the words that were on the first tablets, which you broke. Moses had come down the mountain before he saw the golden calf with these 2 stone tablets, the 2 copies of the covenant that described, here's how we're going to be God's people. And he sees what's happening, and Moses throws those tablets down, smashes them against the rocks, which is appropriate because they've broken the covenant. It's pointless now. It's a joke now. They've already, in 40 days, violated their promises to God. And so Moses smashes those promises. But now it's God who initiates the reconciliation. It's God who reaches out to these rebellious, adulterous people. And he says, Moses, let's try again. But this time, God's going to reveal his whole name. Because these people still don't really understand the God that they're dealing with. And at that day and time, a name was hugely significant. A name captured your essence. It captured your very nature, your very core. And so this time when Moses goes up the mountain, God gives Moses, in a sense, his full name. And this is what God reveals to Moses and what God reveals about his heart. So Moses chiseled out 2 stone tablets like the first ones and went up to Mount Sinai early in the morning as the Lord had commanded him. And he carried the 2 stone tablets in his hands. Then the Lord came down in the cloud and stood there with him and proclaimed his name, the Lord. And he passed in front of Moses proclaiming, the Lord, the passionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. That's the name of God. That's our God. He's patient, he's loving, he's dependable. He delights in forgiveness. But he's not going to ignore sin forever. In fact, he had every right to wipe out the Israelites right there in the desert and just start over with Moses. He could have kept all of his previous promises. He could have done that and just completely start over with just the one faithful guy that he had. But he didn't do that. Now, he did send a plague to punish the Israelites. That's how that horrible chapter in your Bible ends. This is a God of second chances. This is a God who delights in forgiveness, but he will not be fooled or ignored. Listen, church, you might be able to fool your parents, and you might be really good at deceiving your teachers, And you might be a pro at avoiding what you don't want to do at work, but none of that is possible with God. If there's a clear lesson in Exodus 32, it's this: don't mess with God. He loves you more than you will ever understand. He is willing to forgive so much, so often. He is willing to forgive in a way that is beyond our comprehension. He is that good. But he is not one to mess with. He sees everything. He is everywhere. And nothing goes unpunished that he deems worthy of punishment. This is a God to be feared. But if you understand what sort of God he is, it's a fear that should draw you near to him. Our fear of God should draw us closer to him. Our greatest fear should be drifting away from him. Our greatest fear should not be having him in our lives completely present as he is. Our greatest fear should be not having him in our lives. I want you to know God. When it comes down to what's my purpose, what's my point, what's my job description, I want you to know God. It's not, I don't want to give you a guilt trip. I don't want to browbeat you into being a volunteer. What I really want to do, and everything I teach and say to you, is I want you to know God. Because if you really understand your God, if you really understand and know your real Father, all that other stuff just naturally pours out. You want to serve. You want to love. You understand that you want to forgive others the way that you've been forgiven. I want you to know God. Now, if this is all brand new to you, if you have no idea where to even start when it comes to the Bible, I would love to sit down and visit with you. Just come grab me after services today, or call me in the church office. I would love to sit down with you and open up the Bible, and let's really start talking about this God and what he wants from you. And this morning, since we're all gathered here as a church family, if there's any way we can be your church family, just let us know by coming forward as we stand and sing.